Last winter, the FBI was praised for its speed in cracking the case of the World Trade Center bombing and bringing 4 suspects to trial. Now, there is some evidence that the FBI may have known of the plot in advance through an informant and might even have stopped the bombing that killed 6 people. Correspondent Jacqueline Adams has the story.
FBI agents might have been able to prevent last February's deadly explosion at New York's World Trade Center. They discussed secretly substituting harmless powder for the explosives, but they didn't, according to the FBI's own informant, Emad Salem. Unbeknownst to the FBI at the time, Salem recorded many of his conversations with his handlers.
You have to. Yeah, because, I mean, the lady was being honest, and I was being honest, and everything was submitted with a receipt. Yeah. Right. And now it's questionable. It's not questionable. It's like a little out of ordinary. Okay. You know. All right. I don't think it was. If that's what you think, guys, fine. But I don't think that, because we was start already building the bomb, which is went off in the World Trade Center. It was built by supervision from the Bureau and the DA, and we was all informed about it, and we know that the bomb start to be built. By who? By your confidential informant. What a wonderful, great case.
On February 6, 1993, a truck bomb exploded under the North Tower of the World Trade Center in downtown Manhattan, causing the loss of 6 American lives in what was, at that point, the worst terror attack in modern American history. The FBI would quickly trace the plot to a group of Islamic terrorists associated with a New Jersey mosque led by the blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, a fundamentalist Egyptian cleric fresh off of helping the Mujahideen fight the Soviet army in Afghanistan. But during the trials for the members of the terror cell, the American government was forced to admit that they'd had a spy inside the group the whole time, a retired Egyptian military officer named Emad Salem. Posing as an explosives expert and fundamentalist Muslim, Salem became the Sheikh's right-hand man and bodyguard, reaching the very center of the terror plot and reporting everything he heard back to the FBI. But what the Bureau didn't know was that shortly after infiltrating the group, Salem began recording all of his phone calls with his FBI handlers, and when those tapes finally saw the light of day, they seemed to contain proof that the Bureau had known about the plan to blow up the World Trade Center before it happened, and may have even helped build the bomb used in the attack. Salem's evidence was so disturbing, even the director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, thought the Bureau may have been involved in the attack, and interrogated the case agents about their level of foreknowledge regarding the World Trade Center bombing. Less than a decade later, the same terror networks, and even some of the same people, would be directly implicated in the 9/11 attacks, and yet despite all the evidence, Emad Salem's role in these events has been written out of the historical record almost entirely. So is it really possible that the FBI intentionally helped to advance a bombing plot against American citizens on their own soil, like Emad Salem said? Was the 1993 World Trade Center bombing a sting operation that went wrong, or an intentional false flag? What was really going on here? On November 5, 1990, the American-born Israeli rabbi and extremist politician Meir Kahane was assassinated at a Zionist conference in New York City. As the founder of the Jewish Defense League and the far-right Israeli Catch Party, Kahane was an Israeli ultranationalist and terrorist with dozens of arrests in Israel for attacks against Palestinians and various terror plots, including a plan to blow up the Iraqi embassy in Washington, D.C. Kahane was especially hated in the Arab world for his open Jewish supremacist beliefs and exterminationist rhetoric, like his proposal that the land of Palestine should be ethnically cleansed to make way for Jewish settlement, with any remaining non-Jews in the region forced into slavery. After shooting Kahane with a .357 handgun, his assassin fled the building, only to get into a shootout on the streets of New York with an armed Postal Service police officer who happened to be nearby. The assassin was taken into custody and quickly identified as an Egyptian-born American citizen named El Said Nosser. Under pressure from the Israelis, American authorities, who initially suspected a hate crime, began looking for any possible links to wider terror networks. Almost immediately, Nosser was identified as a member of the Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn, led by the blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who had immigrated to America only months earlier. The blind Sheikh had first come to prominence in the Islamic world for his recorded sermons, which became popular in jihadist circles, being passed around the madrasa schools and terrorist cells of the Middle East, North Africa, and Pakistan. As terrorist groups inspired by Abd al-Rahman began ramping up their attacks within Egypt, the Sheikh was tried, alongside a group of his followers, for the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in 1981. Even though many of his comrades were convicted, the Sheikh walked, but later ended up on house arrest and was ultimately expelled from Egypt. Eventually, Abd al-Rahman made his way to Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen in their war effort against the Soviet invaders. As a preacher and propagandist, Abd al-Rahman was responsible for recruiting foreign militants looking to wage jihad and procuring international funding for the fight against the Soviets. It was in this latter capacity that Abd al-Rahman would establish relationships with both Osama bin Laden and the CIA to coordinate infusions of cash and fighters for the Afghan war effort. By 1989, the Afghan war was drawing to a close, and despite being one of the most prominent Islamic terrorists on earth, and even listed on the American government's own terror watch list, Abd al-Rahman was granted at least 4 separate visas to enter the United States during this period, the last of which eventually led to permanent resident status. After the World Trade Center bombing, the New York Times quoted the head of Egypt's information service, saying, "He raises funds and sends money back to Egypt with couriers. He passes on messages to his followers, giving orders about what they should do next and who they should target. We don't understand why the U.S. authorities have allowed him to enter the country." A State Department report later revealed the obvious. The visas had been granted by the CIA, stretching as far back as 1986 at the latest. El Sayed Nosair's trial for the assassination of Meir Kahane became something of a cause célèbre among American Muslims. The Rabbi Kahane, who had spent his life advocating for violence and terrorism against the enemies of Israel, had ironically died in an act of terrorist violence, which some of them saw as a just reward. The courtroom was frequently packed with sympathizers for Nosair, with the blind Sheikh's followers chief among them. Although the FBI had started surveilling the Sheikh's Al-Farouq Mosque as early as 1989, it was apparently during the trial of Al-Sayed Nosair that the Bureau decided it needed to infiltrate Abd al-Rahman's inner circle. With this objective in mind, the FBI would recruit the main character of this story, the confidential informant and alleged agent provocateur, Emad Salem. Salem spoke good English, having been educated at the elite American school in Cairo. Little is known for sure about his early life, but Salem claimed that he had reached the rank of major in the Egyptian military and was relatively wealthy and privileged while living in Egypt, with multiple household servants and chauffeured private cars. However, it is notable that some of the descriptions of Salem's life in Egypt don't really comport with his claimed occupation as a common military man. According to the journalist Peter Lance, who spent years extensively interviewing Salem, quote, "Prior to his disillusionment with the Egyptian ruling class, Salem had been something of a fixer in Cairo. He was the go-to guy if you needed anything, from a private tour of the pyramids at Giza to some backstage time with the lead belly dancer at the Hilton. Once a friend of his put down 30,000 Egyptian pounds as a deposit on an apartment, but the unscrupulous landlord simply kept it, so the friend called Salem for help. He showed up with a pair of uniformed men. He pulled out a black hood and threw it over the landlord's head. I told him that if we didn't get the money back for her, he would disappear," Salem says. At first, the landlord stood his ground and claimed he didn't have the money. Then Salem took the hood off and went eyeball to eyeball with him. Though short in stature, he has an imposing presence. He was a champion wrestler in Cairo and a second-degree black belt in judo. The landlord swallowed hard and gestured for them to remove a wall picture. He then opened the safe and handed back the money. "My friends always knew they could count on me," says Salem. By his own telling, Salem had always admired the United States, but he had no intention of leaving Egypt until one night in 1986, when he was invited to the basement of a federal police precinct in Cairo, where behind a locked iron door, he saw a man hanging upside down, being tortured by Egyptian authorities. According to Salem, his disgust with the Egyptian political system reached a tipping point, and he resolved to move to America. During the trial, multiple journalists reported that Salem had shown them photographs he smuggled out of Egypt depicting other torture scenes, including some showing a man and woman being locked in a cage and burned with cigarettes, suggesting that Salem may actually have been more familiar with the Egyptian government's use of torture than he wanted to admit. Now, Salem was openly telling these stories and showing the photos to Peter Lance and other journalists, but there was no explanation as to why someone who was supposedly a major in the army like Salem would have been making nighttime visits to civilian police precincts and getting repeatedly looped in on interrogations involving torture. So Salem was a fluent English speaker who was being chauffeured around Egypt, acting as a fixer who had no problem kidnapping, intimidating, and threatening civilians without facing any consequences, and was routinely getting called into interrogation sessions the Egyptian government thought were important enough to torture people over. This sounds more like the resume of an intelligence agent than an army major. And in fact, some of the early media coverage of the case explicitly says that Salem continued his relationship with Egyptian military intelligence after his retirement from the army. The story of how Salem got recruited to become an informant for the FBI is just as convoluted and contradictory. His pension from the Egyptian army wouldn't go very far in his adopted home of New York, so after getting his U.S. citizenship, Salem took on a number of menial jobs, including as a cab driver and security guard. Despite this seemingly meager income, Salem lived with his American wife in a fifth-floor suite at the relatively upscale Bretton Hall Residence Hotel at 2350 Broadway on the Upper West Side. Decades after the trials, Salem told the journalist Peter Lance that his work as an informant began as a lucky accident after he took a job as the night manager of the Hotel Woodward, a rundown hotel popular with Russian diplomats visiting the UN in Manhattan. One night, Nancy Floyd, a special agent for the FBI, walked into the hotel. She was a petite, tough-talking redhead from Texas who was working Russian foreign counterintelligence. Floyd asked Salem if he might do her a favor and examine the room of one of the Russians who'd checked into a suite on an upper floor. When she told him she had to get a warrant, Salem was ready to use his passkey on the room. Anxious to prove his worth, Salem did his own black bag job, meticulously removing the outside wrapper of a Russian cigarette pack for prints and copying the full contents of the diplomat's briefcase. It turned out to be an inspired move. The documents provided the Bureau with new details on the emerging Russian mob. After another 6 months helping Floyd and an INS agent on a series of cases, Salem announced to her that there's a man in this city more dangerous to America than the worst KGB hood. Who? Asked Floyd. Salem told her about Rahman. At the time, the sheikh was preaching at 2 mosques in Brooklyn and a 3rd in Jersey City. It seems notable that by Salem's own telling, his first work for the FBI involved helping an agent perform an unconstitutional search of a hotel suite without a warrant, an early indication of the dishonesty and anything-goes mentality that would define his work for the Bureau. Tasked with infiltrating Abdelrahman's inner circle, Salem presented himself to the sheikh as an explosives expert, with a hatred for the Egyptian government and its benefactors in the United States. After introducing himself to the group at El Said Nosair's trial for the assassination of Meir Kahane, Salem quickly earned the sheikh's trust, acting as his bodyguard, driving him to out-of-town fundraisers and jail visits with Nosair, and even coordinating the sheikh's media appearances. According to Salem, the FBI gave him 3 months to infiltrate the group, but it only took him 3 weeks. In interviews after the bombing, other members of the mosque, who were never indicted, indicated that far from being a passive observer, Emad Salem almost immediately began trying to provoke acts of violence by Abdelrahman's followers. Reporters quoted a local Muslim activist saying, "He's been going around for a long time trying to incite the other brothers into doing things that were illegal." Another source said Salem actively promoted the plot, trying to push others along. One of the blind sheikh's followers, quote, accused Salem of brashly talking about violent action and trying to incite people to do crazy things. And once again, Salem's behavior would much more closely resemble that of a spy than a simple informant, like when he appeared to bug the phones of the sheikh's inner circle. "He was sitting in the sheikh's house," said the follower of Abdelrahman who asked not to be named. "I found him there with a bag in his hand, and he said, 'This is what I used to do when I was a private investigator, check the apartment for bugs.' He starts going around the phone, everything," the man said. "I was just watching him. I didn't know what the hell he was doing." The man said Salem had also checked one of the bombing conspirators' phones in the same fashion. The official story says that Salem first started working for the Bureau in November of 1991, when he began attending Nosair's trial, befriending members of the blind sheikh's entourage, and frequenting his Al-Salam Mosque in Jersey City, New Jersey. But in recounting his history as an FBI informant decades later, Salem claimed that he had spent 6 months working on immigration cases for the INS before being assigned to the World Trade Center bombing case, implying that his informant work likely began far earlier than the government admitted at trial. But whatever the case, it is clear that Salem infiltrated the sheikh's inner circle early enough that the Bureau should have had plenty of advance warning that the World Trade Center was about to be attacked. So why didn't they stop it? Well, the story that the government told in court was that Emad Salem stopped cooperating with the FBI just a few months before the attack because of a dispute over his role as an informant. In the government's version of events, higher-ups in the FBI began demanding that Salem wear a wire during his interactions with the Sheikh and his followers, and Salem refused, fearing that he would be called as a witness in the case against them, revealing his role as an informant and endangering his relatives back in Egypt. In this version of the story, Salem stopped working with the FBI in July of 1992, some 8 months before the bomb went off in February of 93. However, defense lawyers in the trials that resulted discovered evidence suggesting that the break had really happened because the FBI had become suspicious of Salem's motivations and loyalties, forcing him to take 3 separate polygraph tests about his actions. When Salem failed all 3, he was supposedly let go as an informant, and the World Trade Center bombing plot took shape at the mosque in his absence. Years later, the journalist Peter Lance interviewed the official who had supposedly ordered those polygraph tests, Carson Dunbar of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, who expressed no remorse despite the failure to stop the bombing plot, calling Salem a, quote, prolific liar who was out of control as an informant. But there is reason to be skeptical of both of these versions of events. According to the official story, on September 1st, 1992, months after Salem and the FBI had supposedly parted ways, the Al-Qaeda terrorist and explosives expert Ramzi Youssef arrived in New Jersey, and over the next 7 months recruited several of the Blind Sheikh's followers to participate in a bombing plot targeting the World Trade Center towers in Manhattan. Without an informant feeding them information from the inside, the FBI claimed, they were caught off guard when the truck bomb exploded beneath the World Trade Center on February 26, 1993. However, when the tapes of Emad Salem's conversations with his FBI handlers were released, they seemed to indicate that the Bureau had not only known about the bombing plot beforehand, but possibly even participated in the bomb's construction. Salem had been recording his exchanges with the Bureau since at least the time of El Said Nosser's trial, and when discussing the bomb plot, Salem repeatedly referred to an apparent plan to provide the conspirators with fake explosive material to ensure that any bombs they constructed would be inert. He requested to meet me in the hotel, Salem says of the supervisor. He requested to make me testify, and if he didn't push for that, we'll be building the bomb with a phony powder and grabbing the people who was involved in it. But since we didn't do that. Notably, the FBI agent on the other end of the call, Nancy Floyd, appears to agree with Salem's version of events. In another point in the transcripts, Salem recounts a conversation he said he had with the other FBI agent on the case, John Antisev, saying, I said, guys, now you saw this bomb went off, and you both know that we could avoid that. At another point, Salem says, you get paid, guys, to prevent problems like this from happening. Do you deny, Salem says he told the other agent, your supervisor is the main reason of bombing the World Trade Center? Salem said Mr. Antisev did not deny it. One quote from the tapes, which notably did not appear in the New York Times, was when, after being told that the expenses he had charged to the Bureau that month had been a little out of the ordinary, Salem replied in broken English, I don't think that, because we would start already building the bomb, which is went off in the World Trade Center. On the same tape, Salem says that the bomb was built, quote, by supervision from the Bureau and the DA. We know that the bombs start to be built. By who? By your confidential informant. What a wonderful, great case. You were informed. Everything is ready. The day and the time. Boom, lock them up and that's that. That's why I feel so bad. Notably, the FBI agents on these calls never pushed back or questioned Salem's version of events, and in some cases even voiced their agreement with his assessments. In his interviews with Peter Lance decades later, Salem appears to have forgotten the official story completely, admitting that even during the months when his FBI informant status had supposedly lapsed, he was still attending the Blind Sheikh's Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn, and had even, quote, learned that a major bomb plot was afoot. According to Salem, he was still meeting with his FBI handler, Nancy Floyd, during this time, months after he had supposedly split with the Bureau. This admission alone completely undermines the official story, and it proves that the narrative of the case presented by the government at trial couldn't possibly be true. If Salem had heard about the World Trade Center bombing plot months in advance, during a period when he was still actively communicating with his FBI handler, then it's almost impossible to imagine a scenario where the FBI was not aware of the terrorists' plans long before the attack took place. In fact, the other main FBI agent on the case, John Antisev, has admitted that in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, he was questioned by the director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, who suspected that the agents handling Emad Salem as an informant may have known about the bombing plot ahead of time. I can't play the audio here because of potential copyright issues, but when Antisev was interviewed on the FBI Case File Review podcast about his involvement in the 93 World Trade Center bombing case, at about 15 minutes and 30 seconds, he relates a story about being called into a meeting at FBI headquarters with Louis Freeh and the entire senior management of the FBI, at which he was questioned about having advanced knowledge of the bombing. I go into Louis Freeh's conference room. All the senior management of the FBI, all assistant directors, deputy assistant directors, section chiefs regarding terrorism and everything else are just in the room, sitting down and standing along the wall. And Louis Freeh was very nice. He was very gracious. He asked me how I was feeling. He heard that I was sick. And then he says to me, "John, I have to ask you a question." He said, "Did you know about the World Trade Center before it happened?" And I said, "No, Director. It was about 12 pipe bombs." And then he said to me, "Are you sure?" And a million things went through my mind. My response was, "What's the matter? You didn't hear me the first time?" And he looked at me and he smiled and he goes, "I'm sorry." This story is remarkable for a number of reasons. The official story says that the FBI didn't find out about Emad Salem's tapes of his conversations with his FBI handlers until months after the bombing, yet Antisev seems to imply that this conversation happened in the immediate aftermath of the attack. Unless Antisev has totally confused his timeline, the implication here is that Louis Freeh must have had some other evidence linking the Bureau to the bombing before he even knew about Salem's tapes, evidence which has never been revealed publicly. But even if we accept that Antisev just misspoke and the conversation took place after the release of the tapes, it's still incredible that the FBI director was so suspicious of his own agents that he felt compelled to interrogate them about whether or not they'd had prior warning of the World Trade Center bombing. Antisev's remark, "It was about 12 pipe bombs," is pretty ambiguous, and he doesn't provide any further context in the interview, so it's hard to tell exactly what he was referring to with this denial. After the bombing, the FBI would track the Ryder truck used in the attack to a man named Mohammed Salem, who would be convicted for the plot, along with Nadal Ayad, Mahmoud Abu Halima, and Ahmad Ajaj, without Emad Salem figuring into the trials at all. Other conspirators, Ramzi Youssef, Abdul Rahman Yassin, and Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, were able to flee or were intentionally deported before they could be arrested for participating in the bombing. But despite his seemingly close relationships with the suspects, the FBI was unable to find any evidence linking Sheikh Abdul Rahman to the bombing, besides a few phone calls to an apartment where the plot's ringleader, Ramzi Youssef, had been living as one of several roommates. According to the official story, it was the FBI's frustration over their inability to prosecute Abdel Rahman, despite knowing that he was involved in the Trade Center bombing, that led them to send Emad Salem back into the Sheikh's circle as a confidential informant. By Salem's telling, he eagerly volunteered for a second chance to catch Abdel Rahman, telling the journalist Peter Lance that he had told the FBI, "I'll go back under. I don't care, live or die. Nobody harms my America." At this point, Salem had been an American citizen for less than 5 years. Any reservations Salem had the first time around about wearing a wire had apparently dissipated, because he immediately started carrying recording devices around the Sheikh and his followers, capturing hours of in-person conversations on tape. According to the official story, Salem's original break with the Bureau, which led directly to the FBI's failure to stop the World Trade Center bombing, was a result of Salem's adamant refusal to wear a wire, and yet here he was, just a few months later, wired up exactly as the Bureau wanted. So why the reversal? Well, it was later revealed that Salem had demanded, and ultimately received, a $1 million payout from the FBI for his services on the case, some of the funding for which was apparently raised from private sources in a highly unusual arrangement. Perhaps it was the $1 million that changed Salem's mind, but there are other reasons to be skeptical of this version of events, which we'll return to later. In this second follow-up case, known as the New York City landmark bomb plot, the government's position during the trials was that Salem, while attending Abdel Rahman's mosque, had been told of plans by some of the mosque's members to attack a long list of targets in New York, including the UN headquarters, the Lincoln Tunnel, the Holland Tunnel, the George Washington Bridge, the St. Regis Hotel, the UN Plaza Hotel, the FBI's New York office, and the Jacob Javits Federal Building, along with assassinations of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, U.S. Senator Alphonse D'Amato, and New York State politician Dov Hikind. To collect evidence, Salem not only wore a wire, but also planted recording devices in various places, and invited the conspirators to an FBI safe house that had been wired for video and audio surveillance. On June 24, 1993, 8 conspirators were arrested in a raid after Salem invited them to the FBI safe house, ostensibly to mix the chemicals for the bombs. Soon after, the blind sheikh surrendered to federal authorities, and ultimately 15 people faced charges of conspiring to levy a war of urban terrorism against the United States. Salem claims that immediately after the raid, the FBI took him to his apartment and gave him and his family just hours to pack up their belongings before being shuttled into witness protection. There are several versions of the story of how the U.S. government discovered Salem's archive of taped conversations. The assistant U.S. attorney, Andrew McCarthy, told the judge on the case that he first learned of the tapes when Emad Salem mentioned them during a debriefing interview with McCarthy, and then voluntarily turned the tapes over to the prosecutors. However, media reports from the time suggest that the FBI had found the tapes in Salem's apartment, among items he had apparently left there in his haste to enter witness protection. Speaking to Peter Lance decades later, Salem gave yet a third version of the story, that he had informed the FBI of the existence of the tapes on the day of the raid, and they'd been confiscated while he was packing up his belongings from the apartment. Incredibly, prosecutors later admitted that after seizing the archive, they let Salem look through the tapes and keep the ones which he claimed contained personal conversations, an issue which defense lawyers later raised on appeal. The whereabouts of those tapes, as well as their contents, remain unknown to this day. The assistant U.S. attorney's representations to the judge that he wasn't made aware of the tapes' existence until Salem mentioned them in an interview is equally notable. Had the FBI tried to hide the tapes from the prosecutors? Or had the assistant U.S. attorney intentionally lied to the judge? Despite the overwhelming level of surveillance the group had been subjected to, the evidence actually linking the blind sheikh to the terror plot was scant. According to media reports from the trial, the single strongest piece of evidence against Abd al-Rahman was a single taped May 1993 conversation between the sheikh and Salem, in which Salem asks if the UN building could be considered the house of the devil and a target of, quote, action under Islamic law, and Abd al-Rahman actually discourages him, saying, "It is not forbidden, but it will put Muslims in a bad light. The UN is not a force for pressure. It'll hurt Islam before the UN. Think of something else, because the UN is considered to be the center for peace. People will say then that Muslims are against peace." Salem then asks if the military should be targeted instead, and Abd al-Rahman says he should, quote, find a plan to inflict damage on the American army itself. Salem tells the sheikh that another conspirator, Sadiq Ali, had, quote, suggested a second target, which is the FBI center at 26 Federal Plaza, and asks the sheikh's opinion. "By God, it needs to be studied," the sheikh says. "Go slow. The person who killed Kennedy was training for 3 years. We don't want to do anything in haste." The word bomb was never used in any of Abd al-Rahman's tape-recorded conversations. And in fact, the single most damning sentence identified by prosecutors, the one where he says that they should find a way to, quote, inflict damage on the American army, doesn't even necessarily imply that violence should be used. And more importantly, the crimes Abd al-Rahman was tried for had nothing to do with the army. How does saying that you want to inflict damage on the American military prove that you're planning to blow up bridges, the UN building, and some hotels in New York? It is pretty ironic that in a terrorism prosecution, the informant is the one on tape constantly agitating for an attack, while the person being prosecuted is advocating for caution, delaying the plans, and targeting the military rather than civilians. On the tapes, Abd al-Rahman even worries that Salem's proposals will make it look like Muslims are, quote, against peace. It almost sounds like the blind sheikh didn't even realize he was supposed to be plotting a terror attack. Somehow, the evidence against the other co-conspirators wasn't much better. The man portrayed as the mastermind behind the plot, Sadiq Ali, denied making any bombs himself and said that Salem had told him that he had been building bombs at the request of Al-Said Nosser, the imprisoned assassin of Meir Kahane. In one recorded conversation, Salem asks Ali, "What do you want? Tell me, what is your target?" And Ali replies, "I want the United Nations. All UN resolutions are oppressive. It is against Islam and Muslims," before immediately warning Salem that the matters they were discussing should not be discussed with their associates. If this was a terrorist conspiracy where the group planned to attack the UN, why was Ali demanding that Salem not mention the UN to any of their associates? Prosecutors charged that the taped conversations showed another defendant, the American-born Clement Hampton L., discussing parts for a bomb he intended to build, But Hamptonell's attorney pointed out that his client mentioned blockbusters and M80s during the same conversation because he had actually been talking about fireworks. Jurors were also shown a video taken by Emad Salem showing Sadiq Ali driving through several tunnels in New York. Salem claimed he had taken the video at Ali's request to demonstrate to the other plotters where they wanted the bombs to be planted and what escape routes to take. Yet there was no discussion of bombs or escape on the video itself. But perhaps the most significant evidence in the case revolved around the informant himself, Emad Salem. Defense lawyers called as a witness Salem's ex-wife, Barbara Rogers, whom he had divorced while he was still undercover. Rogers testified that Salem often boasted of his ability to manipulate audio tapes and doctor dialogue. That fit in with the defense claim that Salem manipulated the tapes he made to frame their clients. Emad said he could edit tapes to make anyone say anything he wanted them to say, Rogers said. He bragged about it. He even threatened to use a tape he made of a conversation between us at our divorce hearing in family court. Rogers also testified about strange calls and meetings with Arab men her ex-husband had in the middle of the night. It's worth noting here that despite Salem's boasting to his wife, the American government never even tried to argue that the tapes they received from Salem were anything other than accurate. And why would Salem be meeting with these mysterious Arab men in the middle of the night? The defense lawyers had a theory. Salem had been a double agent for Egyptian intelligence all along. On the stand, Salem was asked about several phone calls he made to Egyptian military intelligence the day Abd al-Rahman was arrested. Finally, I have him on tape giving the order, the informant said in a transcript read aloud in court. Are you sure you didn't come here to situate yourself as an agent of the Egyptian government? One of the defense lawyers asked. Absolutely not, Salem said. However, Salem did admit that he had been in contact with Egyptian intelligence regarding an interview with Abd al-Rahman, and his response to questions about his involvement with them was often confusing and contradictory. Salem's American wife, from whom he was divorced but to whom he was still close, told New York Newsday during the trial that he had recently sent a set of the bootleg tapes home to Egyptian authorities with a visiting relative. And remember those 3 polygraph tests the FBI had forced Salem to take right before he stopped being an informant because they were questioning his loyalties? The defense lawyers discovered evidence that those tests had actually focused on the FBI's suspicion that Salem was still acting on behalf of Egyptian intelligence, and that was why Salem had failed all 3 tests. In fact, if we accept the theory that Salem was a double agent working for Egyptian intelligence the whole time, then suddenly many of the strange anomalies of the case start to make a lot more sense. Like that story about Salem refusing to wear a wire and then suddenly changing his mind just months later with no rational explanation. The reason it makes no sense is because that was just a cover story made up by Salem and/or the FBI to cover up the failed polygraphs and the fact that the FBI had knowingly used an Egyptian intelligence asset as a confidential informant. And if Salem was getting money from the Egyptian government, then that explains how he was able to afford that residency hotel suite on the Upper West Side on a hotel manager's salary. Salem has always publicly maintained that he tape recorded his conversations with the FBI because he believed they were planning to double-cross him and possibly even prosecute him, along with the rest of Abd al-Rahman's associates, to cover up the botched infiltration of the World Trade Center bombing plot. However, media reports from the time revealed another possible motive. Apparently, Salem had tried to use the tapes to blackmail the FBI. At least once on the tapes, Salem clearly tells the FBI that he's been taping his conversations with agents, and at one point he even tells them, in what appears to be an attempt at blackmail, that he put the tapes in a safe place and wrote a message if, God forbid, something wrong happened to me from the FBI, these tapes gotta be sold to one of the, CNN, or, I did something like that to protect my heirs. Could this mean that the $1 million payout was really a bribe to keep Salem from revealing everything he knew? And was that whole story about letting Salem keep the tapes with private conversations on them just a cover story to keep some of the more damaging recordings out of the trial? To evaluate the defense's theory about Salem being a double agent, we need to consider the context of Egyptian politics and Egyptian-American relations at the time. Ever since the Camp David Accords in the late 1970s, when Egypt normalized diplomatic relations with Israel after decades of tension, Egypt had become the second biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid after Israel itself, an arrangement which many observers have characterized as a bribe of the Egyptian ruling class, intended to prevent tensions with Israel from boiling over into open conflict. The Camp David Accords had been signed on behalf of Egypt by Anwar Sadat, the leader of the country's secular government, who was seen as a modernizer and moderate nationalist, the heir to his predecessor and ally Gamal Abdel Nasser, the founding father of modern Egypt. Although Sadat was popular among ordinary Egyptians, the Islamic extremist allied with Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman hated the secular nature of his government and viewed the signing of the Accords as a capitulation to Israel and a betrayal of Islam. Abdel Rahman was widely considered to have contributed to the assassination of Anwar Sadat through his vociferous anti-government sermons, and in the late 1980s, the movement he helped lead in Egypt, referred to in English as the Islamic Group or Islamic Jihad, committed dozens of terror attacks against the Egyptian government and foreign tourists within Egypt. Although Abdel Rahman had been acquitted of the charges related to the assassination of Sadat, he had been implicated in multiple plots to assassinate Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, and at the time of his emigration to America, he was still officially wanted in Egypt for inciting a riot in Cairo that had left hundreds dead. Although the Egyptian government wasn't actively seeking Abdel Rahman's extradition, they considered him a destabilizing force in the country's politics and an avowed enemy of the Egyptian state. But if Abdel Rahman's terrorist associations were so widely known, then why was he allowed to enter the United States? Media reports from the time suggest one possibility. Abdel Rahman, 55, slipped into the United States from the Sudan in 1990 despite being named on a State Department watch list of suspected terrorists and attracting a following including Arab militants named in several terrorist cases. An administration official in Washington said Saturday that the authorities could have marshaled enough evidence to justify arresting Abdel Rahman. However, he said, the cleric was seen by some officials as an intelligence asset who helped investigators gain information by monitoring those drawn to him. "We're in no rush to do anything about the sheikh," he said. "We know what he's up to. He doesn't represent anything we can't handle." Similar sentiments were expressed by the then president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, who was quoted in Egyptian media calling Abdel Rahman a paid CIA asset. "The sheikh has been a CIA agent since his days in Afghanistan. He still earns a salary. The visa he got was not issued by mistake. It's because of the services he did." As mentioned earlier in this video, Abdel Rahman had also worked with the CIA to coordinate American funding of the Mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan War, and the CIA had been directly involved in approving the Sheikh's visa applications for the US going back to at least the mid-80s. So how did Abdel Rahman go from a CIA asset receiving special privileges from the US government to an FBI target being charged with terror offenses on seemingly meager evidence? There are several plausible answers. Clearly, the Egyptian government had a significant interest in seeing Abdel Rahman neutralized as a political force within domestic Egyptian politics. Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, was continuing in his predecessor's footsteps, running a moderate, secular government which sought to keep the Islamic extremist elements of Egyptian society in check. Abdel Rahman had been preaching and issuing fatwas against Mubarak, just as he'd done against Sadat, while acting as the spiritual leader of the jihadi groups that were committing terrorist attacks all over Egypt. Mubarak's government made clear that they had no desire to extradite Abdel Rahman from the US because the prospect of trying and imprisoning him domestically presented unacceptable risks of civil unrest and terror attacks. Perhaps the Egyptian state sent Emad Salem to the United States for the express purpose of spying on the sheikh, or trying to get him in trouble with American authorities. One offhand remark Salem made to a journalist seems to lend credence to this interpretation. During a taped interview shortly after the Trade Center bombing, Salem claimed that he had known Abdel Rahman from their time in Egypt years earlier. Now, it is of course possible that Salem was just lying on this point, but if he was telling the truth, the implications are vast. Was this whole sequence of events just a continuation of an operation started by the Egyptian intelligence services years prior? That would certainly explain how Salem was able to get so close to the sheikh so quickly when the FBI thought it would take 3 months. It would also help explain how Salem had apparently come to be known in New York as a, quote, generous benefactor of mosques and the sheikh himself, despite supposedly living on a hotel night manager's income. Maybe he could afford to donate so generously because he was spending the Egyptian government's money. Under this reading, the Egyptians used Salem to force the United States to act against the sheikh. But there are other possibilities. Perhaps the United States decided to target Abdel Rahman of their own volition as a favor to the Egyptians, and the involvement of Emad Salem was just a happy accident. The American government has never had a problem burning their own intelligence assets, so sacrificing Abd al-Rahman to shore up the alliance with Egypt in the wake of the Cold War's end may have just been a tactical decision on America's part. This is not to say that the blind sheikh was definitely innocent of all the charges against him. Perhaps the FBI legitimately believed that Abd al-Rahman was responsible for the World Trade Center bombing, and they were willing to use an unethical sting operation to put him away. The publicly known evidence against the sheikh for the New York landmark bombing plot case was shockingly weak, and there was so little proof of his involvement in the World Trade Center bombing that he was never even charged for it. But the sheikh was famous for his ability to toe the line of illegality with his sermons, such that he was never actually advocating for violence or breaking the law. After all, Abd al-Rahman had even won an acquittal in Egypt on charges related to Anwar Sadat's assassination, despite having issued a fatwa against him, because the sheikh had cleverly avoided giving any explicit directions to his followers about assassinating the president. The Egyptian criminal justice system was certainly biased in favor of prosecutors, but apparently these kinds of technicalities weren't enough to get Abd al-Rahman off of charges in the American federal system, with its 99% conviction rate. Sheikh Omar Abd al-Rahman was ultimately convicted of seditious conspiracy, solicitation to murder, conspiracy to murder, solicitation to attack a U.S. military installation, and conspiracy to conduct bombings. He was given a life sentence of solitary confinement and spent the rest of his life in federal medical prisons for federal convicts with acute medical needs until passing away at age 78 in the Federal Medical Center at Butner in North Carolina. El-Said Nosser, the assassin of Meir Kahane, was initially acquitted on state murder charges related to the assassination, but was later convicted federally on similar counts, and ultimately received a life sentence on numerous convictions stemming from his alleged participation in the landmark bomb plot. Ramzi Youssef, likely the true mastermind of the World Trade Center bombing, was able to flee the United States before being identified as a suspect. He would go on to commit other terror attacks, including the 1994 Imam Reza shrine bombing targeting a Shia holy site in Iran, and may have even met Terry Nichols from the Oklahoma City bombing case when they were both in the Philippines, but that's a story for another time. In 1995, Youssef was captured in an operation by the Pakistani ISI and the U.S. Diplomatic Security Service, and then convicted of various federal crimes. He's serving a life sentence in the ADX Florence Supermax Federal Prison in Colorado. Despite describing him as the ringleader of the landmark bombing plot in the charging documents, prosecutors allowed Sadiq Ali to plead guilty and accept an 11-year prison sentence in exchange for providing testimony against his co-defendants, which buttressed the government's version of events. This included affirming prosecutors' accusations that the group had planned to kidnap former President Richard Nixon and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, in addition to all the other bombings and assassinations. Another defendant, Abdo Hagag, agreed to testify against his co-defendants, and in exchange, all of his charges were dropped. Eventually, the 9 remaining defendants were sentenced to federal prison terms ranging from 25 years to life. The confidential informant, Emad Salem, only spent a couple of years in the Federal Witness Protection Program before dropping out and settling permanently in an undisclosed location in the United States. Ironically, Salem occasionally gives guest lectures at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, and has even given book and TV interviews over the last 15 years. The FBI's whole alibi for the '93 World Trade Center bombing was that Salem was so terrified of reprisals from other Muslims that he quit cooperating with the FBI in the middle of a sting operation just to avoid being publicly identified as an informant. And yet here he is, 10, 20, 30 years later, telling on himself on network television. For their part, the FBI has apparently abandoned any attempts to maintain the facade surrounding the case, allowing the principal characters involved to give interviews contradicting the most basic facts of the official story on a fairly regular basis. The actual FBI agents who handled Salem suffered no real professional consequences, with John Antisev even being assigned to work on future terrorism cases. He was even depicted in the Hulu adaptation of the Lawrence Wright book, The Looming Tower, for his interrogation of one of the bombers from the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in Nairobi. Anyone even marginally familiar with the FBI's counterterrorism operations during the global war on terror probably already realizes that the FBI has routinely used corrupt, dishonest, confidential informants to build cases that would likely never have existed without the Bureau's involvement. In the wake of 9/11, the FBI regularly won convictions against mentally ill and disabled people like Matthew Laneza in fantastical and sometimes absurd alleged terror plots like the Liberty City Seven, who supposedly planned to wage war against America by attacking the Sears Tower in Chicago mounted on horseback. But in this case, we have a confidential informant in Emad Salem, who is almost certainly a double agent working for Egyptian intelligence, who failed FBI polygraphs over his dishonesty and dual loyalty, and who recorded FBI agents discussing their foreknowledge of a terror attack on U.S. soil in perhaps the clearest case of LIHOP versus MIHOP in modern American history. And yet this story remains almost entirely unknown, even in the more paranoid corners of American political discourse. And I'm sure that's the way the FBI wants to keep it.